The Hitchhiker's Trap. There's an old saying that the kindness of strangers can be a saving grace. Well, my experience with hitchhiking taught me that it can also be a curse. It all started when my car broke down on an isolated stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting, and I was miles away from the nearest town. The shadows grew longer, and I knew I was in for a cold night if I didn't find help. With no cell service and desperation growing, I decided to hitchhike. It was something I'd never done before, but my options were limited. I waited for what felt like hours, watching the road in both directions, hoping for a sign of life. Just as I was about to give up and prepare to spend the night in my broken-down car, I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, hoping the driver would stop. As the car drew closer, I felt a surge of relief and excitement. But when the car pulled up beside me, my enthusiasm quickly turned to unease. The driver was an old man, with a thin face and beady eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He rolled down the window and stared at me for a moment before speaking. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice like the creaking of old floorboards. I hesitated, but finally nodded, explaining my situation. He gestured for me to get in, and I climbed into the car, grateful but still on edge. The inside of the car smelled musty and was filled with odd trinkets and old photographs. The old man didn't say much as we drove, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were always on me. I tried to make conversation, asking him where he was headed, but his answers were vague and cryptic. There was something about him that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As we drove further down the winding road, I noticed that the landscape was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. The dense forest gave way to barren land, and the road itself seemed to be deteriorating. I asked the old man if he was sure we were going in the right direction, but he just chuckled, a hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You wanted a ride, didn't you?" he said, his eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. "I'm taking you where you need to go." I felt a growing sense of dread, and my instincts were screaming at me to get out of the car. But we were in the middle of nowhere, and I had no choice but to trust this strange old man. The night wore on, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before us. I lost all sense of time and direction, and the old man's presence became increasingly oppressive. Finally, we reached a small, dilapidated house at the end of a long driveway. The old man turned to me, his face twisted into a sinister smile. "Here we are," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Your destination." I stared at the house in horror, realizing that I was not where I was supposed to be. The old man's smile widened, and I knew that I had walked into a trap. I tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. I struggled and screamed, but the old man just laughed, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. "You wanted a ride," he said, his voice filled with madness. "You wanted to trust a stranger. Now you'll pay the price." I was trapped, helpless, and at the mercy of a madman. The terror of that night is something I can never fully describe, and the memories of what happened in that house will never leave me. I eventually managed to escape, though the scars of that experience will never heal. The old man was never found, and the house itself seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving no trace of the horrors that took place. I learned a hard lesson that night, a lesson about trust and the dangers of the unknown. I'll never hitchhike again, and I'll never forget the face of the old man who took me down a road less traveled, a road that led to darkness, madness, and terror. The kindness of strangers can indeed be a saving grace, but it can also lead you down a path from which there is no return. Beware the road less traveled, for it may take you to a place where nightmares come to life. The road less traveled. There's a stretch of road that I'll never forget. It's etched into my memory, a winding path that haunts my dreams to this day. Several years ago, I was driving across the country, taking in the sights and sounds of small towns and hidden landscapes. I was young, fearless, and eager for adventure. But my journey took a dark turn one cold, foggy night in the remote hills of Appalachia. I was driving along a desolate highway, the fog so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. The radio was filled with static, the loneliness of the road bearing down on me. That's when I saw him, a lone figure, standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched. I hesitated, my instincts warning me to keep driving, but something about him drew me in. He was an older man with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. As he climbed into the car, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. He introduced himself as Samuel and thanked me for the ride. His voice was raspy, his words slow and deliberate. He told me he was heading to a town just up the road, a place I'd never heard of. As we drove, Samuel began to talk, his stories weaving a dark tapestry of local legends and folklore. He spoke of ancient curses, haunted woods, and strange rituals performed under the cover of night. His eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, and I found myself drawn into his tales, despite the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The road twisted and turned, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. Samuel's stories grew darker, his voice dropping to a whisper as he spoke of a local legend, a cursed hitchhiker who wandered the road, seeking revenge for a betrayal long ago. I laughed nervously, dismissing it as just another ghost story. But Samuel's eyes bore into me and he said, "Believe what you will, but some roads are best left untraveled." We reached the turnoff to the town Samuel had mentioned, but as I slowed the car, he placed a gnarled hand on my arm. "Keep driving," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Take the road less traveled." I was filled with terror, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to stop the car, to demand he get out, but something in his eyes held me captive, and I found myself obeying his command. We drove for what felt like hours, the road becoming narrower, the woods closing in around us. Samuel's stories grew more twisted and grotesque, his laughter echoing in the confined space of the car. Finally, we reached a clearing and Samuel instructed me to stop. The fog had lifted, revealing a decrepit cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. "This is where you leave me," Samuel said, his voice cold and emotionless. "But remember, the road less traveled is never truly left behind." He climbed out of the car and disappeared into the night, leaving me shaken and disoriented. I turned the car around and sped away, the terror of the encounter still fresh in my mind. When I reached the main road, I stopped at a gas station, my hands trembling as I filled the tank. The attendant, an older man with kind eyes, asked if I was all right. I told him about Samuel and the strange journey we had taken. His face paled, and he looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "You've seen him," he whispered. "The cursed hitchhiker. He's a legend around these parts. They say he was betrayed by his own kin and now wanders the road, luring travelers to their doom." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind reeling from the realization that I had encountered something unnatural, something beyond explanation. I continued my journey, but the experience stayed with me, a dark shadow that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. The road less traveled had revealed itself to me, its secrets etched into my soul. Years have passed, but I still feel Samuel's presence, a ghostly reminder of that fateful night. I avoid lonely highways, especially on foggy nights, fearful of encountering the cursed hitchhiker once again. And so, dear friends, as you journey through life, be wary of the paths you choose to take. For sometimes the road less traveled holds secrets best left undiscovered, and once you venture down that path, there's no turning back.